Today I want to talk about the effects of climate change on ecosystems. Because this is the first of our discussion of impacts, I want to start out by thinking about a statement that presidential candidate Newt Gingrich made in response to a question about climate change when he was running back in 2012. He said, "Look, I understand the science and believe that carbon dioxide warms the planet, but I have a question for you. What makes you think that the current temperatures are the best of all possible temperatures for humanity on Earth? The planet's been a lot warmer in the past. It's been a lot colder. Isn't it possible that warmer would actually be better?" It's a really good question that bears thinking about. Hopefully, those of you who took my One Earth class are right now thinking about the threshold concept: new types of change disrupt and damage entrenched systems. What we'll see is that in most ecosystems, there are some organisms that will benefit from changes and some that will be harmed. But if the changes are of a large enough scale, then the main effect is likely to be a fraying of relationships between organisms that have different levels of tolerance for these changes, or that respond to them differently. And on the time scales that matter to humans, that means the potential for ecosystem collapse before the systems can reconstruct themselves, either through reorganization or evolution. When we're looking at the big picture, there are two major mechanisms by which climate will most affect ecosystems: this changing of relationships and shifting species ranges, so we'll focus on these two here. For the changing relationships, let's first think about signals that cause organisms to get started in the spring, things like leafing out, flowering, emerging from eggs, or migrating to a region. Evolution has tended to favor individuals that respond to these signals in ways that are favorable. For example, think of a migratory bird that's evolved to exploit the spring emergence of caterpillars for feeding their young. However, different species use different signals to identify ideal times for activity. Some, like a lot of plants, emerge once soil temperatures reach a particular level. Others, like trees leafing out or many insects, are triggered by air temperatures. Still others are light triggered based on day length. The last is quite common, for example, in spring birds that migrate a long distance because temperatures in their winter latitudes may well not be correlated with temperatures in their summer habitat. A good recent example of this was described by Burgess et al. In Nature, Ecology and Evolution 2018, where pied flycatchers migrated into the UK and relied on a peak in population of oak caterpillars to feed their young. As temperatures have warmed, the emergence of the oak caterpillars has occurred earlier in the spring, but the date of arrival of the flycatchers has only moved up slightly. Thus, in many years, the caterpillars are able to pupate before the flycatchers are ready, and so the latter are left without food for their young. If this change occurred slowly enough, then the birds could, of course, adapt, but rapid changes may lead to several years of unsuccessful fledging and steep population declines, especially if populations are already reduced by other factors. You could imagine this climate-induced phenological mismatch having other effects in the ecosystem. For example, if it led to an explosion in a now uncontrolled oak caterpillar population and several consecutive years of defoliation for the trees. This is the kind of change that's happened countless times in Earth history, during all sorts of climatic shifts. Over time, especially for species with large populations and deep gene pools, adaptation happens, or new species fill empty ecological niches, but on timescales of interest to humans, the losses and cascading effects can be significant. These sorts of phenological mismatches tied to climate change have been observed in nearly every type of system: plant herbivore, plant pollinator, agricultural systems, herbivore parasite, phytoplankton zooplankton in both marine and freshwater systems, and so on. Some of these systems adapt, some don't, and often adaptation occurs in some regions but not others. Another interesting shift is related to C3 and C4 plants. You may have learned that there are a few large classes of plants separated by how they do photosynthesis. 95% of all plants are C3, and they include things like trees and cold season grasses. You may also be familiar with the Calvin cycle in photosynthesis. Energy from the sun is used to produce NADPH and ATP, and those then power the fixation of carbon dioxide into a 3-carbon sugar called G3P, and because it's a 3-carbon, we call the process C3. G3P, in turn, is usually then used to make 6-carbon sugars, which can be used for energy or combined into things like starches and cellulose. The reaction relies on atmospheric carbon dioxide diffusing into the reaction site, and if the carbon dioxide concentration in the leaf is too low, then oxygen will sometimes bind to the RUBP instead of carbon dioxide. And so the cycle then will happen and energy will be used, but you won't get G3P out, and so the energy is lost. Since all of this happens inside the leaf, CO2 gets used up and concentrations drop well below atmospheric levels, making oxygen competition possible. Now, leaves have the little adjustable holes in them that allow air exchange with the atmosphere that are called stomates. If CO2 levels are low, plants need to be able to open these stomates relatively widely, or they'll lose a lot of the energy in the Calvin cycle because there won't be high enough concentrations of carbon dioxide. The problem with keeping stomates open is that then the plant will lose a lot of water because it will simply evaporate out of the open holes. Photosynthesis relies on water for the hydrogen it needs, so not having enough water in the leaves will also stop photosynthesis. So C3 plants are always working to balance getting enough CO2 with holding onto their water. Because of this, C3 plants benefit a lot from what we call carbon fertilization. Essentially, the higher the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the more they can keep their stomates closed and conserve water without losing too much energy. In the tropics and grasslands, many plants have developed an adaptation that conserves a lot of water, and that's the C4 pathway. This pathway can be so efficient that it's evolved independently multiple times in numerous plant families. In the Midwest, the most important C4 plants are a few lineages in the Asteraceae family like daisies, several sedges, the spurges, and the warm season grasses that are so important to tallgrass prairies. Essentially, C4 plants add a 4-carbon CO2 pump that concentrates CO2 at the site where the Calvin cycle is happening and thus avoids competition with oxygen. That allows the plants to conserve water by keeping their stomates more closed because high CO2 concentrations within the leaf are far less important than they are for C3 plants. The drawback is that pumping the CO2 burns a fair amount of energy itself, so the oxygen competition problem has to be fairly bad before the energy loss is worth it. Oxygen competition is particularly problematic at high temperatures because the extra motion makes distinguishing between the molecules more challenging, which is why this adaptation is so common in warm season and tropical grasses. The reason why I'm going into such detail here is that hopefully this helps you to see that climate change will impact ecosystems like prairies, where C3 and C4 plants are in frequent competition, in complex ways. Because they're well adapted to heat and dryness, you might expect C4 plants to thrive under a changing climate, but the truth is that they have already realized most of the benefits from this adaptation. At the same time, they don't benefit as much from all the carbon fertilization because their CO2 pump makes them fairly insensitive to atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So, in many ecosystems, we actually expect C3 plants to increasingly outcompete C4 plants when we add carbon to the atmosphere, while the C4 plants will experience added stresses of climate change without any real counterbalancing benefits. As with changing relative phenologies, this would not be a major problem over very long timescales because there are C3 plants which can occupy most of the ecosystem niches currently occupied by C4 plants. But in the short term and medium terms, this is likely to lead to strains throughout the food web for species that are C4 obligates or consume them. Moreover, C4 plants make up a disproportionate fraction of crops that humans grow, like corn, sugarcane, millet, and switchgrass. They're all C4. Another major way that species will be affected is by habitat shift. As temperatures warm, habitats in lower latitudes and altitudes that are at the warm end of a species' zone of tolerance will no longer be suitable for many of those species. At the same time, higher latitudes and altitudes that had been outside of their zone of tolerance may become suitable. In past climate warmings, entire ecosystems have migrated to higher latitudes or higher altitudes, and because of this possibility, Climate changes, for example, like those we've seen coming into and out of the ice ages, have not generally led to mass extinctions. The problem this time is that we've dramatically limited the ability of ecosystems to migrate due to fragmentation. Forests migrate northward, for example, when trees die at their southern range from fires or increased heat stress, but then new seedlings can grow to the north in places where they hadn't been viable before. But those new seedlings need to take root. They need a place to grow. If we have forests that act essentially as islands within a sea of agriculture, it's possible that there's no potential habitat to the north of a current forest that's within the seed dispersal range. And in that case, no new trees can grow, and the trees may be cut off, no longer able to survive in their current area, but unable to move to a new suitable range. Similarly, while many animals like birds and butterflies can be highly mobile, those that can't fly long distances may be similarly cut off from potential new habitat by fragmentation. It won't be particularly helpful for a bird to get to a new system if the bugs or seeds that it eats can't also get there. In this way, fragmented terrestrial ecosystems are expected to be broken apart by rapid anthropogenic climate change in ways that they hadn't been in previous climatic shifts. Ecology is all about individual examples, and there are plenty of other changes that we expect that will affect ecosystems. Changes in microclimates, shifts in rainfall, and in marine systems, ocean acidification is expected to be particularly problematic. But hopefully this has given you a sense of why climate change is expected to be hard on natural systems, especially those that cannot migrate or are already stressed, or those that have limited gene pools due to other anthropogenic causes, like habitat loss.